now. Yes, okay. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for showing up on this fairly sunny Friday afternoon. We are really, really happy that you are here today. And after, we have a coffee break, but then we also have a reception afterwards as a little treat in the end. Today we'll talk about the Sahel region and international European interventionism there. A few years ago, Africa's Sahel region was on the very top of the EU's security agenda. Significant resources were being mobilized to this region, and international organizations, Western countries were highly present across the region. This is no longer the case today. Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 shifted Europe's focus towards the East and the Eastern threat, and away from the Sahel region. And this shift in focus is also sort of symptomatic of a broader trend and a broader change of the global order of today's world. It also tells a larger story of European and African relations that are in crisis. The world is evolving, and European governments are struggling to find out how to position themselves in this new landscape. Of course, the Russian war in Ukraine is not the only reason why Europe is scaling down its ambitions in the Sahel region. There have been growing anti-Western sentiments amongst Sahelian governments and populations for decades, along with an increasing resistance towards European and Western interference, which has made it challenging for European and Western countries to stay engaged. And in the meantime, Sahelian nations are also finding new partnerships with countries such as Russia and China, which sort of goes back to this broader narrative of a changing global order. The current collaboration on non-cooperation between the West and the Sahelian nations, and also sort of the broader EU, European, African relations, raises some very fundamental questions. How do state and civil society actors in this particular and very important region perceive European intervention partners, and what are also sort of how should European and Western policymakers adapt to a changing world order? These are sort of some of the questions that this seminar will take up, not necessarily answer, but at least discuss. And to do so, we have, in my opinion, some extremely relevant speakers. In the first half of the program, Signe Ravnkilde, a senior researcher here at the Danish Institute for International Studies, and Andrew Lebovich visiting us this week from Washington, D.C., a researcher at Klingendal, and also a researcher here at DIIS. We'll start off with a sort of rundown of what's going on in the very important cases of Mali and Niger. Actually, Signe and Andrew, and also myself, are doing a research project on some of these questions. Yeah, if you want to know more after today about this research project, which you probably will, then do reach out to us. And then we'll have a very short coffee break. After that, we'll have Hans Lucht, a senior researcher here at the Danish Institute for International Studies, presenting his work and views on migrant sending communities in West Africa, and also the extent to which migrants have become the new hybrid weapons of our time. Then, but certainly not least, we're really happy also to have Birgitte Marcussen, Director in Humanitarian Affairs from the Danish MFA, previously an EU ambassador to the African Union, many other things you have also done, who will discuss the very easy question on sort of ways forward for the EU, giving this highly challenging context that the other speakers have or will lay out. So let's get started. Signe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is the microphone on? Can you hear me in the back? Yes, great. Yes, I only have 12 minutes, so it's going to be a bit headlines for a rather complicated study that we've done. But after a decade of unsuccessful Western-led military interventions, Mali's new military government was the first to reject European and international intervention actors, turning to Russia and the Wagner Group for new security partnerships. A move that was subsequently followed by Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And of course, a move that's also in the wake of the war in Ukraine has garnered quite some geopolitical significance. In European policy circle and the Western media in particular, these developments are often attributed to the expanding scope of Russian military, economic, and diplomatic engagements, including in particular disinformation campaigns that are aimed at undermining Western military interventions. And while we should not underestimate the role of Russia's enhanced diplomatic efforts to re-bolster African partnerships, this is well documented. What we'd like to highlight here is that this emphasis on the role of external players pays insufficient attention to how, also within the era of the digital, anybody with a smartphone at hand can contribute to hybrid warfare. And in the case of Mali, influencers, also what they call themselves, video men, have become a new form of cyber combatants. They have been quite crucial for garnering popular support for the military regime, and also a significant influence in this broader Pan-Africanist struggle against Western military interventions. So my presentation today also tells a broader story of the role of the smartphone as a new weapon in Western's African hybrid warfare. And I guess this is not only a phenomena that is going on in West Africa, but it's in basically a global phenomenon. This research builds on work that I've done together with my Malian colleague, Almami Silla, who unfortunately could not be here today. And the results are going to be published in a forthcoming issue of International Affairs in July, if you're interested to get more into the details. And here we show how the smartphone technology emphasizes the agency of Mali's new political actors and how they also participate in Mali's digital warfare. I'm not a trained video man myself, so I'm just gonna see if I can get this to work. There's no sound.
Mais en nous interdisant, ils n'ont fait que donner plus de consistance à ce combat, parce qu'on n'interdit que ce qui est dangereux pour les intérêts globaux de l'humanité.
And actually, what we're seeing here is a press conference for Yirevolu Debout sur les Remparts, which is Mali's foremost anti-French and pro-Russian political movement. The leader is now arrested. I can't come into the details about that. I'll be happy to explain more about it. But here we see the leader, Ben Lissavaux, who's actually sitting on the left, together with the French Benoit activist Kemi Seba. He's a very famous social media phenomenon, known for publicly burning his French passport, denouncing imperialism, and calling for African liberation. Seba has also been a key figure in Russia's social media campaigns against the West in Africa. And the point is, this is just a normal press conference. Maybe 50, 100 people are clapping and joining it, and you can also see, maybe you saw this little screen in the towards the left. But what the point is that there are several of these so-called video men. So I'm just going to show you another clip from Yerevalu's big rallies. Here you see them. They'll come back. And there again. So yes. So it's just to show that while there are these people present, you also see a lot of people with smartphones, but you also see these video men that are equipped with their smartphones that are capturing the events for this online potential hundreds and thousands of followers. And this is a growing phenomenon. I know there's a big electricity failure in Mali right now, so it might be difficult to charge. But anyway, in the course of Mali's security crisis since 2011, the number of internet users has increased from 2% to 33% of Mali's 24 million citizens. And importantly, these live streams transmissions, of course, reaches Mali, but they also reach the diaspora across the world, which is also a very important political influential figure. But who are who are these video men? Before the spread of the internet and social media, public discourse was mainly controlled by the government and large media companies. Today, this image is characterized about what people refer to as online chaos, and in which these video men play a central role. So they live stream during rallies, they document live from places where traditional media does not have access to. Some sell content to others, more important, also to the international media, BBC. Others work more on their own and just distribute to their own channels. So it's actually not necessarily very structured. But like influencers in all over the world, they take advantage of how social media is not very regulated, so they can say and write basically what they want. And as their online content circulate, people engage, share. They also influence people's participation of what's happening, the acts of war, who are part of it, who is the legitimate, both national but also external actors to this conflict. And in this way, also just ordinary people, the same way as we say like or not like to victims in Gaza, everybody becomes part of a like war where you either say yes or can also instigate violence, and in this way transforms into cyberwarriors, virtual combatants, which also has an impact on conflict dynamic. In one of the world's poorest countries with very high unemployment rates, particularly among the young urban population, becoming a video man is a very fast and easy way to make money. We know that the numbers of views are crucial, so that kind of economy also creates an incentive to produce more sensational content that attracts viewers and thus increase revenue. As well as we also know that things can also be bolstered and paid for to get more engagement and therefore go higher up in the algorithm. So the point is, we can talk about Russia's information campaigns in Mali, but they don't drop down on an empty plate. This new influencer industry makes it easy for both national and international power holders to pay for political influential campaigns. So back to Ben Le Cerveau, Ben the Brain, as he's called, the leader of Yerevalu, who we saw in the press conference before. This influential movement has kind of crafted the ideologic backdrop for the military government. Many of these movements has been present since also 2012, but they've been a bit sidelined during the IPK regime. So with the big protest movement of M5, these different protest movement really gathered momentum to speak out there dislike and content with the former regime. So through Ben's also very central role in Mali's new governing council, he also gained access to the Wagner Group, which supports the military government's political strategy. According to Malian journalist, Wagner has paid Ben up to 75,000 euros, hoping to sort of gain popular support through Ben's charismatic figure. And Ben and Irevolo and this movement shared the military regime's very clear aim of making Western military interveners leave Mali. First France, Takuba, we saw the whole fuss around that, and then also the UN peacekeeping mission MINUSMA. And according to these narratives, they're all part of the same way of how the enemy seeks to infiltrate Mali, which is then all over the place. But the interesting thing, as we've been following these guys' activities online for a few years, is that Ben de Savo and many of these members in Irevolo, they're not very active online themselves. What they do is that they use these video men to bolster their claims and spread their messages online. So it's much more impactful, and this is also part of Malian culture, that the king doesn't go and tell himself that he's a great guy. You need all the griots to say that you are great. So in a way, these guys becomes the cyber griots that spreads the message to the people and can speak and praise their patriotic engagements. And this guy, here he's on with Malian Gandhi, which is Irevolo's main video man. He's a bit semi-professional channel, and they are very good at live streaming, but also having these more political debates online. Gandhi Malien has over 1 million Facebook followers, and their most streamed videos, like the one we see here, they have often more than 100,000 views. Just to illustrate how these campaigns, for instance, against MINUSMA did not happen overnight. Here we see the average numbers of likes for Gandhi Malien per month over time, and you can see that there's quite an increase here in July 2020, which was a coincidence, and it's always difficult to see if there is like correlation, but it coincided with ECOWAS's sanctions, but also at this point there was this big fuss about Côte d'Ivoire contingent for the MINUSMA mission, and the government started saying that they didn't exactly know what the Côte d'Ivoire contingent was doing in Mali, and putting some doubts around that. And then the video man was very fast at picking up that and calling them mercenaries. And then this mercenary narrative spreads very fast. So we see how video men are important in spreading rumors about MINUSMA and accelerating the conspiracies about the true aim of an already very unpopular mission. And important to know, of course, that there's an existing fatigue with the former regimes and these missions that many people don't think have delivered on the mandate. I don't have time to address that. This is just to say how these narratives accelerates. Irevolo has also been active in the support of coups in Burkina Faso, where they go with the protest movements there, and also in Niger, and we've seen that Gandhi Malien is also in Russia and having a blast there. So our conclusion is quite clear. Access to smartphone and the internet gives ordinary citizens like these video men increased power, also to influence how people perceive of and participate in civil war characterized by jihadist resurrection, humanitarian crisis, military coups, and close collaboration with Russia. So the coup is often described as a result of Russian influence, but this narrow focus on Russia forgets the importance of African actors as well as these new digital practices and how they have shaped support for Mali's current regime. And very important also in local languages so people can actually hear and understand what's being said on a very daily basis. So the perspectives I'd just like to say is not to disregard the impact of Russia. With French military operations leaving, MINUSMA has left, and the Americans are shutting down the world's largest drone base in Niger. Western security actors are losing eyes and ears on the ground. And from a military perspective, I mean, this is just one of the equipment that the Malian regime got from Russia. There's also all these rumors about quite important radars that are able to detect everything that goes on the ground. And we don't exactly know where that information goes to. It might go to the Malian state, it might go to actors outside. As an intelligence officer in Gao said to me once, everyone is in Mali to spy on each other. So that Western forces are unpopular and get kicked out means that the European Union or the Europe and its member states, they lose ability to influence crisis management in a strategic, important region, and perhaps also misses the opportunity to learn from some very important lessons on what went wrong. And on that happy note, I'm gonna pass on to my distinguished colleague, Andrew Lebovich. Thanks for your attention.
Can everyone hear me? Yes, it's working. Okay, great. So thank you, Christine. Thank you, Signe. Thank you all for coming for this presentation. And I spared you my abysmal PowerPoint skills, so I'll just be presenting. But I'm going to look briefly at Niger as a test case, or a kind of test case for how EU interventions evolved in the region over time and where things went wrong. And this is informed by fieldwork that I conducted as part of the project that Christine mentioned, both before, during, and after the coup in Niger last year. So Niger is interesting as a case study for a number of reasons. It was the first country in the region to have an EU CSDP mission, the Capacity Assistance Program that was meant to train police and other internal security forces established in 2012. So Mali from 2013 onward was very much the locus of quite security-heavy interventions, starting with the French-led Operation Sahel and Barkhane, the UN peacekeeping mission, MINUSMA, and then, of course, the EU CSD, the EU training mission, and the country's own UCAP mission, and later the Special Forces Task Force Takuba. Niger featured a bit of a different mix of these interventions that were often more discreet, though still very ever-present in the country, that focused much more on training and capacity building, with a very direct but smaller security presence, both for assistance and operations, and then the presence of a number of foreign military partners, sometimes coordinating and also each doing their own kinds of training. Italy, Germany, Belgium, the United States, of course, and others. And so while the interventions in Mali fell in different ways under very significant and very direct French influence, in Niger, the EU as an institution, as well as its member states, including France, played a much more active role in shaping training and assistance packages to the country, and the EU delegation in Niger in many ways played a more active and a more prominent role than similar delegations in Mali or Burkina Faso. And so even before insecurity in the region more noticeably spread to Niger, the migration crisis in Europe made Niger not just a focal point for interventions from across a spectrum of activities, but Niger's comparatively more effective and more willing political leadership, at least as it was seen by Europeans, made the country into an example in their eyes for the region to follow. Again, this is as European officials, as American officials often saw Niger. And this was so much the case that on a 2017 visit to Niger, Nigerian officials actually complained to me about the number of EU and EU member state delegations that were visiting the country at the time, saying that having to receive and tend to these delegations was making it impossible for them to do their actual work. Now, this focus on Niger paid significant dividends to the country, at least on paper. So there were significant outlays of not just security assistance, but development assistance, and a significant percentage, I believe it was around 30 or 40% at certain times of Niger's budget was directly paid by the EU and other partners. And unlike its Sahelian neighbors, Niger was often eager not just to receive trainings and assistance, but to cultivate and work very closely with donors on a variety of programs in ways that seemed significantly more positive than in Mali or Burkina Faso. This continued from the period of Mahamadou Issoufou into the presidency of Mohamed Bazoum, though of course Bazoum's own role in working with the international community as a minister and key political figure under Issoufou helped contribute to the sense of continuity. And many of the programs that were in place when Bazoum became president, he had already crafted before, or played a significant role in crafting. And so as the political climate shifted in the region and French forces, MINUSMA, were expelled from Mali and also from Burkina Faso, Niger became much more of the focal point for direct security interventions and also as a kind of last place for EU missions as well. So by the time of the coup in Niger, Niger was not just considered what in French you would call a kind of bon élève of the West, and a key partner, but also, as the title of this presentation holds, it was a kind of last bastion for Europe and for the United States in the Sahel when all other doors seemed closed to them. And this is how we can arrive at a situation that was a bit odd in retrospect, where just weeks before the coup, EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell could say when he was on a visit to Niger that Niger is a solid, reliable partner, both politically and in terms of security. And we support President Bazoum enormously with all our might. We support his regional vision, his vision of economic development that combines security with growth and education. So then this leads to the question of how could we actually have gotten so much wrong or misunderstood so much about Niger? And I think on the one hand, we should say that people in government and the EU missions were aware of the tensions that existed within Niger's security services and armed forces, as well as the very contentious role of France in particular. There were, of course, a number of contingent and very complicated reasons behind the coup, many of which those of us who work on the region are still trying to sort out. But a couple of the things that I saw during my fieldwork and have observed over time is that, first of all, there was widespread skepticism among many members of Niger's security services toward not just France, but particularly toward EU initiatives and trainings. This was the case, as I said, before the coup even, and some officials, including some who worked very closely with the EU and US to formulate programs, were often in private openly dismissive of these initiatives and openly dismissive of the CSDP missions in particular. The deployment of UCAP Sahel to Agadez following the 2015 anti-migrant law contributed significantly to making migrant crossings more dangerous without necessarily significantly impacting overall migration, as we've seen. The law was also incredibly unpopular, which is one reason why the CNSP moved very quickly to repeal it after taking power. The CSDP missions in Niger and Mali were also marked by incoherence and a lack of accountability in training, and the creation of a kind of training economy and what you could call a per diem economy that did not always prioritize or privilege the needs of Sahelian security forces, but did privilege the needs of the EU to hold these trainings and to account for them and to demonstrate that people were attending them. There's also widespread awareness in Niger and a feeling that these initiatives were not for the benefit of Niger and Nigerian, despite massive spending and effort put into the training, assistance, and humanitarian and development aid in the country. And there's also a very important thing, which is that even though France was much more openly in the lead in Mali in particular, the role of France as a kind of penholder and driver of EU policy and the domination of France in debates about Niger and about the Sahel and their postings within the CSDP missions was also enormously unpopular. And many people in Niger and across the region saw the French presence as one driven by French arrogance and France's past rather than current needs and current understandings of the region. And so I'm going to wrap up here by saying there's also more broadly skepticism in general among security services, but also across a spectrum of Nigerian political thought about the large foreign military presence in the country, and a feeling that the people who were deployed were not always doing the things they said they were doing. And so this is where a lack of communication and a lack of clarity made it very difficult for people to understand why there was such a significant military presence in the country. And this is something that made it quite easy in many ways for the CNSP to seize on these narratives about the foreign military presence, whether true or not. And there was also a last point that I'll make before wrapping up, that there was very much a tendency in Niger, especially before the coup, to understand very clearly what foreign sponsors and foreign advisors wanted to hear and then give those narratives back to them, which also helped create this image that suited very much what the EU, what France, what the United States wanted to hear about not just the capacity of Nigerian actors, but their willingness and desire to pursue these programs that were often being pushed from the outside. With that, I look forward to the Q&A and further discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Andrew and Signe. Go over there.
Yes.
Yeah, this was extremely interesting, and we will open the floor so we can sort of include all of you sitting here, but we'll do that after all of our speakers have contributed. So therefore, I'll take the advantage of being the chair and ask you a few questions. I think I'll start out with you, Andrew. And I'd like to sort of do a very big picture question. From your perspective, sort of what would you say, now we have this changing geopolitical context, and why is it necessary that European and Western actors sort of keep their eyes on the Sahel region and restructure or redefine how they will be present in this region? Could you sort of take us through what also stability and instability of that region means in a broader political geopolitical perspective?
Great. Well, this is a
very easy question.
Easy. I'm sure I can get through this very quickly.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing about the changing geopolitical context that's interesting is that, of course, with people often will frame the entry of Russia and China into the Sahel in the same breath, even though they operate very differently. They're pursuing often very different goals. And of course, the Chinese entrance into the region is much older than Russia's more recent presence. Though there are, of course, long-standing connections during the post-independence period, especially between Russia and China. Anyone who's ever been to Bamako, when you drive into Bamako from the airport, you basically have to drive by a giant socialist realist mural on the side of the road that depicts Chinese cooperation with Mali in its struggle. So it's very emblematic for me. But I think the first thing to say is that in Europe and the US, especially with everything that's happened over the last couple of years, there's a tendency to talk about the Sahel as a sort of locus of geopolitical competition,
Right.
Which of course is a bit complicated because, as I like to say, especially in Washington, in order to have geopolitical competition, you actually have to be competing, which the US often is not.
Right.
But it's also important, I think, to understand, not from an overly securitized perspective, but to look a bit objectively at what's happening in the Sahel, not just in terms of competition, but on the one hand, there is a massive security and humanitarian crisis underway. I would butcher the numbers if I tried to say, but I think it's either a majority or just almost a majority of deaths worldwide caused by terrorist attacks are happening in the Sahel right now. There's a massive displacement crisis in Burkina Faso, where more than 2 million people are displaced internally. There's a massive refugee crisis in the region. And as instability spreads and insecurity spreads, it's already impacting coastal states, and it's going to continue to impact those states. So that's just a regional problem that has to be dealt with. Now, there's a tendency in Europe sometimes to fearmonger or exaggerate about this kind of possible hordes of migrants coming toward Europe from the Sahel or being kind of unleashed from the region. And we need to be very careful not to engage in that kind of discourse. But it is important to keep attention on the difficulty that people face in the region, the difficulty that migrants face passing through the region, and the stress that this places on North Africa, the stress that it places on Sahelian states, and then eventually does become a challenge for Europe also to try to address and to hopefully manage in better and more effective ways. But I think the point, to sort of bring it back, this is a very important region for what is happening in it right now, for the kind of scale of these crises, but also there are a number of opportunities and a number of ways that Europe and the United States could intervene more positively to promote growth, to try to promote better political management, political stability. It's not really happening right now, but there is still significant opportunity that is not being tapped into, but that could present opportunity for the future.
And of course, I need to ask, what are those better and more effective ways for Europe and Western countries to stay engaged and redefine its role?
I was hoping I could avoid answering that one.
Yeah, you can.
So I think the first thing what's hard right now is because of the political upheaval and because of the shift in partnerships, there isn't really a lot that can be done right now for Europe.
Okay.
Or for
So
the United
it's
States.
a
But I think
medium-term.
well, it's more of a medium and long-term issue, and I think there's still again a significant need for engagement, but it has to be over a much longer term. So there has to be a true strategy in place that addresses the needs of Sahelian countries, that addresses the needs of Sahelian populations, but also can show real commitment rather than this kind of constant recycling of personnel and people and a lot of money that flowed into the region that people didn't really see the impact of. So there are ways to revise this presence, there are ways to reform it, there are ways to make it better. But for the next potentially couple of years, that might also mean a lot of watching and listening and talking to people without much of an impact. But it's still very necessary to be doing that work and doing that listening and doing that planning now.
That makes a lot of sense. And perhaps just one last question to you, Andrew. How would you say that sort of Niger's strategic importance in the region would also shape its relationship perhaps to the neighboring countries and also some of these external powers that are involved in Niger, but also in the region as such? Also a very easy, quick to answer question.
I'm glad we're going to cover a lot of ground with these questions. Well, so Niger is in an interesting position because of its actual placement very much at the heart of the region. And Niger as a historical crossroads for goods, for people. And then, of course, there's the fact that Niger has significant reserves of uranium. Niger is starting to use already its oil reserves to try to push its economy in a new direction. There are, of course, also a significant number of raw materials, gold, other things in Niger and also elsewhere in the region. And that's not in any way a call to see the region as a source for these things and only to focus on that. But it does mean that there are opportunities, again, to go back to this theme, to use the materials, the kind of raw materials and also the human capacity that exists in the Sahel to help the Sahel advance its own status and position rather than forming a kind of new exploitative compact with the region.
Beautiful. You're off the hook now, Andrew. Thank you so much for sort of elaborating these really these interesting points. And Signe, I also noted down quite a lot of questions for you, and we'll see how many we have time to go into. I'd really ask if you would elaborate a bit on sort of the very last point of your presentation, where you talked a little bit about the significance and the reach of these groups in terms of also shaping positions and perceptions of the local population. So a couple of questions on those points. First of all, how do you say that that the role of this kind of what you'd call it cyber warfare, what has it meant in the broader picture in Mali? Sort of how influential have these groups actually been in the broader picture?
Yeah, thanks for that, Christine. I think, as I also mentioned, many of these sort of more Pan-Africanist protest movements have been simmering for a long time. We've also seen major contestation, for instance, around the Algiers peace agreement in Mali. There was this ne touche pas ma constitution. Other were like j'ai tout compris. I wish I had that, like I've understood everything. So a lot of this has been simmering, but I think at some point they realized that in order to get particularly at the youth, social media and telephone technology was a very important medium for reaching the public. And I think also personally for me, because I've also worked a lot on like the northern groups, the Fulanis and internally displaced, being in Bamako and not being able to go to these places, it was interesting for me to actually talk to these youth elites, and also very interesting to notice the differentiated view that I had of the crisis and what was going on, or I would say me just as representative of any kind of Western type that tries to do fieldwork here, and then the perceptions on the ground. So I really got the sense that there's really something going on here. And then of course I've been speaking to the press and to many of these video men, and it's very clear that they are, as I also said, they have outcompeted the traditional press, and then there's of course this thing that you can try to control narratives, and there's a balance I think that the military government is walking right now between also trying to crack down on more critical voices. We saw that Ben Lissavo was arrested because he actually wanted the elections to happen. They were postponed for a while. So while these popular figures that has some kind of legitimacy and perhaps resonates with these broader quest for, and I think that's very important, like the quest for sovereignty and the quest to push against imperialism is something that is simmering across the region, not just Mali, many places. But saying that also is that many people say they are Pan-Africanist, but of course this is also a very contested thing. We have a nice PhD project on that. The different actors also claim legitimacy, and they all talk about Modibo Keita. We saw one of them out at his tomb and celebrating. So they're really using some of this former ideology to make a new narrative, and this is actually part of what you're also saying about this change in and the quest for an alternative world order. So I think it's quite influential, just to be brief.
Yeah. So and that's
but there's one thing I'd also say that is noticeable is, and that's also WhatsApp group. I also see a tendency to like ethnic conflict being more and the debates being more polarized. So it can also accelerate the existing conflict dimensions in the sense that hate speech against certain parts of the population and lack of solidarity, these things, they also accelerate very fast on the net. Yeah.
Very interesting. So you would say that they sort of reflect the broader public position also regarding Western interventions, involvement that has been throughout the years.
I would also say that like our own democracy has been threatened by these kinds of campaigns and how things can be distorted, I think we need to think and reflect more about the role of tech actually in crises and conflicts around the world, which is what this special issue is actually addressing. So we haven't understood the depth of that yet.
No, that makes it, and which leads me to my next question. Of course, how should we respond to, and we, who are we? But now, in terms of the topic of today, how should Western policymakers respond to these kind of movements and what they represent?
I think the whole tech industry is a thing in itself. To evade being media and evade any kind of responsibility, that is of course up to governments, because what Mali have done is that they've then at the same time done these very harsh cyber crimes that actually punish people that are outspoken. So I think it's also difficult to actually, as an external intervener, to start. You can have debates about this and inform. I think the donor society has been quite engaged in funding bloggers and people that are trying to counter fake news, but also educate populations about how easy it is to construct a video of Frenchmen doing dodgy things in the desert, or someone with a Russian flag, and there is not that sort of criticism of how you can manipulate content. So awareness about that is important, but I'm also like, we're really running behind here. I mean, you have 8, like how many schools have been closed down? Like basic education is very delicate. So this whole thing about being critical to what you see, It's
Yeah, that. Thank you so much. And I think now we will have a very short break. We'll have time to stretch our legs and grab a cup of coffee, and then we will reconvene in 11 minutes at 2 o'clock and move on with our program. Thank you so much, Andrew and Signe. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I'll do very little. I'll just give the words to Hans.
Thank you so much. I will be talking about migrants as hybrid weapons, quote unquote, today, and how this applies to Niger, Russia, and the trans-Saharan routes. My name is Hans Lucht. I've been working on irregular migration from West Africa across the Sahara and the Mediterranean to the workplaces in Europe for about more than 20 years now, with a special focus on the migrant perspective. Why do people leave? How do they leave? What is the facilitation like? What are the kind of social, political realities, geographical realities that people move through as they go on this high-risk journey to Europe? What do they hope to obtain? What kind of losses do they incur at the same time? My work is more kind of actor-based than based on big political developments, but I will try to say something about that anyways today. And just last week I published this book called Vores liv ryster, Our Lives Are Shaking, and it's a book on it's a book of documentary poems that consist only of migrant voices that I have arranged in verse. And if you're interested in migrant perspective, you can travel with the migrants here from a small village in West Africa called Senyapliku, across the desert, across the sea, to the workplaces in Europe and back again, everything told from the migrant perspective. So I shamelessly promote this book every time I get a chance, and it looks like this. So today I will be talking about migrants as weapons of mass migration, migrants as weapons. I have some hesitation with this terminology, obviously, since there is already a lot of suffering and death out there on the migration routes, and talking about migrants as a kind of warfare, of course, has a risk of enhancing the suffering of migrants. But it is an idea that has gained traction in recent years, increasingly in political and security studies, seeing migrants and refugees as having quasi or military capabilities that various geopolitical enemies or rivals can use to pursue goals that are otherwise not obtainable. The analytical dimension of this draws on Kelly Greenhill's influential book, Weapons of Mass Migration, which again, from a perspective of political science and international relations, looks at the long history of using migrants as pawns in political power plays. And Greenhill does a very interesting job of kind of tracing the many instances and showing us that this is nothing new. Only the temperature of the rhetoric has risen dramatically, and I would add also the human consequences of migration. In Europe, we're familiar with the recent history of using migrants for political gain. Gaddafi, Erdogan, Putin, Lukashenko, but the list of examples is in fact much longer. 50 years ago, India accused Pakistan of refugee aggression. East Germany too, during the Cold War, threatened West Germany with migrants from Middle East and South Asia. And not only in Europe, but in the US too, obviously, this kind of phenomenon has a long histories with transit countries or sending countries like Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua putting pressure on the US using migrants and refugees. And actually, recently, only a few weeks ago, the New York Times ran a story saying that Mexico's President Lopez would in fact be able to determine the outcome of the US election if he decided to do more on the border spectacle. So the stakes are very high in migration. You win and lose elections based on migration, and politicians and decision makers, of course, respond to that. But what are the kind of typical features when migrants are used as pawns or as leverage? We typically see it's authoritarian states putting pressure on liberal democracies. Not exclusively, but that is a very typical thing. We see poorer countries exercising pressure on richer countries to obtain financial or political gains that would be otherwise difficult to obtain through conventional politics, and when outright conflict is not possible, typically because of asymmetrical power relations. One example is Morocco. Last year, Morocco blocked 90,000 people from leaving to Europe, according to their own security sources. Whereas when they have a crisis in the political relationship with Spain, they allow people to leave. Morocco, of course, denies this, but it seems quite clear that that is the case. Since 2022, Spain has supported Morocco's claim and de facto rule over the now occupied Western Sahara, a policy goal that would have seemed almost unobtainable only a few years ago. In the US, the situation is a little bit different. You have Republican-controlled border states that ship migrants to big liberal cities in the north in a kind of internal and partisan power struggle, which is also not totally new. We also have some of the same things going on in the EU, Italy, other southern European countries, allowing people to leave to Germany without fingerprinting them in a kind of civil disobedience to the EU system. Another dimension I would add here is the fear and panic caused by migration and the sense of victimhood in Western countries vis-à-vis migrants. So migrant as hybrid weapons works because, one, there is a fear of the voters, and two, because there's a fear that newly arrived migrant groups will change and challenge host societies in unwanted and uncontrollable ways. In more extreme versions, this kind of fear of migrants has become, have mutated into the great replacement theory, the fear of becoming a minority or being replaced or even extinct by migration. This is very long and a very heavy subject that I could say a lot about, but in the interest of time I will not do that here, except to say that obviously when migrants become associated with an existential fear that we are going to get the white majority in Europe or the US will become extinct, then certain political transformations take place that put migrant lives in danger. But there's nothing new, again, in migrants being associated with this fear. And Rhys Jones, the geographer, in his book White Borders, show how US immigration policy has for more than 100 years taken into or been framed by the fear of various migrant groups. Also, migrants as hybrid weapons is not only a geographical, physical phenomenon, it's also a cyber war. Recently in the US, Russian misinformation campaigns have focused on migrant crime and pushed migrant crime into mainstream media, boosting the fear that migrants are coming to kill, a white majority. I haven't seen whether that's the case in the EU and in the EU election. I wouldn't be surprised if it were the case. Here is Lukashenko on the border with Poland, assisting or comforting Afghani refugees before pushing them into Poland. And here's Niger then. I don't know, I'm just talking here, Christine, you have to control me. I have been working here in Agadez, the city of Agadez and the Agadez region since 2010, especially working on facilitation of migration. And obviously so much has happened in this time, and the desert routes are very agile and very flexible and opportunistic, and they adjust to the political changes that are going on all the time. This was after the implementation of the law against human smuggling in Niger, and Chancellor Merkel and then President Issoufou were very close friends, and it was a big success story for Europe that they had managed to engage with Niger and bring and crack down on the migration routes across the desert, and he was actually often a visitor in various places in Europe. My research at the time, my research showed that migrant drivers turned to other kind of merchandise instead of migrants, especially tramadol, which became a very, very big commodity in Niger. The drivers would go to Nigeria, buy it, and drive it to the militias in Libya, who both sold this drug and also consumed it. The tramadol has been connected to Boko Haram very heavily, also child soldiers and so on. Many of them are using this drug in order to be able to carry out atrocities of various kinds. Then this happened in Niger, and Andrew already told us a little bit about it. The coup and the kind of movement towards Russia. And again, I'm not the big expert here, but sometimes I had the feeling that waving a Russian flag was like maybe waving a red flag in the face of France more than they actually was a symbol of them loving Putin or Russia in a very serious way. But what happened, of course, was that not only did they gravitate towards Russia in terms of security, and we see here the Russian deputy defense minister. He was visiting Niamey many times, but they also ripped up the migration agreement, or the law against migration, meaning that migrants again could travel via the Agadez region and to Libya, something that was very popular locally in Agadez, and the law, of course, very unpopular. But also here we see again the same Russian deputy minister visiting Field Marshal Haftar. I don't know who appointed him Field Marshal, but he is Field Marshal Haftar, the leader of one of the governments in Libya, and displaying here weapons. They have said, the Russians have sent many shipments of weapons and equipment to Libya, and there's a generally a kind of tight coordination between Libya or Eastern Libya and Russia. And that is, of course, important when we talk about the fear of migrants as hybrid weapons, because could Russia, which is now controlling or working with Eastern Libya, and Haftar, who also happens to be controlling the militias on the border, the Tubu militias on the border are controlled by the Haftar family. Also over here, there's a little bit here that's not controlled by Haftar, but otherwise we now see a situation where potentially Russia could have influence on the routes connecting Africa sub-Saharan Africa with North Africa and the routes to Europe. So that's a concern, of course, for many security actors in this field. I would say we haven't really seen this happening yet, and you have to always consider that African countries like Niger and Libya have their own interest and are very capable of playing these games, and they're not necessarily pawns in the interest of the Europe or Russia. But we are seeing some signs that the routes are flourishing again. Here we have the Tomo Pass, which is the most typical one, and I should maybe say that the reason why Niger is such a crucial point of connection is that you can drive actually directly via the desert across the Tomo Pass and into Libya, whereas otherwise you would have to walk the Hooker Mountains or the Tibesti Mountains. So Niger, obviously, for thousands of years, has been this central point of connection between sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. And right now, we are seeing Russia potentially having an impact here. There are also other things I could discuss, but I think I'll leave it here for now, and then we can return to that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Hans, for almost not going over time. Birgitte, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Some I know, some I don't. Yeah, thanks for the introduction before, just to claim a bit where I come from and in what position and role I speak right now. I'm now working as Director for Humanitarian Affairs in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I not only work with Sahel, I also work with Gaza, Ukraine, Syria, and so on and so forth. That's quite interesting, broad, of course, perspectives. Before, as some of you will know, I think I worked on the Sahel issues for more than 14 years or something like that. First as a Danish Africa Director here in Copenhagen, working with some of you here in the room, a lot on the Sahel. Actually, I just came back. I was Danish ambassador to Burkina Faso and Niger before I became Africa Director. So I was there when the first problems started to emerge in Burkina Faso and also in Niger. And then I moved to Brussels and worked for a few years as Africa Director there, and then EU Ambassador to the African Union from Addis Ababa, just back last year. So right now, it's a bit I try to come in with that EU experience and where I sit right now. I wanted to share with you, thanks a lot to those who spoke before, because I thought that was really very, very interesting and very, very insightful. I wanted to touch upon 3 issues in this, in looking at what ways forward right now. And the first one, we call it I saw in the program, we call it introspection. Maybe I would call it lessons learned. What's the type of thinking takeaway that I see from European colleagues? And the second one, talking about what are the EU interests at the moment? What are the joint interests with the peoples of the Sahel? And then the third point, what are the guiding principles that the European Union would be thinking of right now? I've got good colleagues in the room who are still working with the EU. Peter sits down there, and I really expect you, Peter, also to chip in. We worked together for a long time on Sahel issues also. But let me look at the EU lessons learned. What I think is important right now when we look at the situation, and some of the previous speakers spoke about to that one too, and I'm speaking now also as humanitarian director, I think it's extremely important to look at the region right now and also look at the facts that we've not discussed so much today. 46 million people are on the brink of facing food insecurity. The region is really in a very, very difficult place at the moment. And I think that's really important. 1 in 5 in the region are actually facing food insecurity. So this is an aspect when we look at the civilian and the population that we have to look at. And of course it's important also to look at the political developments, but there are really very serious trends going on at the moment. And that's, someone was mentioning the displacement and the issues of the complex humanitarian access. The reason why we have these problems is there is not at the moment sufficient access to all areas to the civil population, and there are some disruption also of supply routes. So I think that's important when we look at lessons learned. Where is the region also in terms of the population and the civilians right now? What's the situation? Because that's going to come back to us. Second one is really, I was in Africa myself in February 2022, and I think some of the lessons we've heard this morning of the trends of the Sahel already coming in 2020, but as I said, I also lived in the region myself in 2010 and for a few years. But the reason why I'm looking at February 2022, of course, that's Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What that meant when you were sitting in Africa was that brought to the forefront some of the trends I think that us who lived in Africa, we absolutely knew, and many African colleagues, was that the trend that started was that African countries, and in particular also the governments and the regimes in the Sahel, they don't want to take side. They don't want to take side between, are we now voting in UN along with Western countries? Are we voting with China, Russia, and so on geopolitically? So I think what we are also seeing in the Sahel is exactly also a trend around this. So I think that's really important, and I know we as Europeans and EU, we need to reflect and look into that reality. And I think it's when you've lived in Africa, of course, it makes a lot of sense. And this is part of, some of you called it Africanism, you can call it many things, but it's really, I think this is a paradigm shift that there are many players on the African continent, like we see actually also globally. The other lesson learned I wanted to take away is very much the importance of, Europeans would always talk about multilateralism, because I'll come back to also the interest, but it's working with the region, with the regional organizations. ECOWAS has really been faced by problems here, and so has the African Union. I was part of many African Union Peace and Security Committee meetings, also discussing this situation, and but still, if you talk about where you come from as someone working from the EU, you would always say, we need to work with the regional organizations. We need to make that work. Of course, the Sahel countries have now created the Alliance des États du Sahel, which is the central Sahel. We know Burkina, Mali, Niger, and they actually had also a meeting I went to in Brussels this week, I think I mentioned, on the Sahel. There was a coordinated intervention from these three countries. So it means that it comes to the forefront also politically. So the last lessons learned is that I want to dwell on is really, I think EU has, and I'll come back to that more, is the importance of staying engaged. We saw all these pictures, but really to rester engagé. And in my present job, I also have the privilege of working with many civil society organizations. And those I meet working also in that region, they say, this is not the time where you as European Union should leave us. So we also need to dive into, there are more realities here. And of course it's extremely interesting to look at, and I spoke with Signe about the digital and so on, the takeaways on that. But I just think that it's important that there are there are also groups representing those points of view. So that was a bit about the lessons learned, what are a bit reflections on the reflections going on, because of course it has been many moments for reflecting on the situation, also in the helicopter perspective. Then the second point I wanted to touch upon is the EU interests. EU would still, in the Sahel, talk about and stand up for democracy, stand up for the rule of law, and what you call the universal values. And of course, we are there. This is a congested and discussed issue. We know, if you've been in Africa, you know the questions you get related to this. But I think that's quite important, that this is at least what the EU would bring forward. There are also interests of which are actually joined. If you look at some of the narratives of the Sahel, is very much linked to security, spread of terrorism, irregular migration, another interest definitely for the EU, building up resilience, livelihoods, another one, supporting African leadership and African organization and integration. There is really, of course, now I work with the African Union for a number of years, but that agenda is so important for the continent to take off. It's not an easy one. It's a very diverse, and so on and so forth. I can get more into some of these issues because time flies, but then I wanted to end up on my third issue, is really what are the guiding principles that are being looked at now. I looked at lessons learned, then I looked a bit at what's the interest at stake, and then what are some of the guiding principles. For the EU, it would really be to look into the African solutions. I mean, it's really, if you look at the Sahel, you would also look at working with neighbor states, because we know they're being impacted. If you go to the coastal countries, we heard a little bit about this, but really looking at how to support that. The type of partnerships, another principle, I think there will be, and there are very frank, direct discussions about, if you do this, we do that, but that's one of the principles that you will also see from the European Union. Two last ones would really be, there's a big difference between what is called the Central Sahel at the moment, and I know that the research is following. There is a big difference being in Mali, being in Burkina, being in Niger. And they come with their different histories, and that plays in, and the EU will also look into this. And then I think what will happen in terms of the staying engaged is really, of course, when there are military regimes in the three countries, it's at the moment, if you look at development cooperation, that's a bit difficult. Where I started saying I now work on the humanitarian areas, I can see, and that was the clear message from the representatives in the meetings, the discussion is, we need to work on this because of the big need that I started saying. We need to understand what the region is facing at the moment. And it's really not only serious security issues, but also serious humanitarian needs. I think I'll end there, and then happy to discuss more. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Birgitte. And now I think I'll call everyone up on the stage, and we'll maybe, I'll just move this table a little bit so you won't stand on top of each other. Perfect. So align yourself.
Yes. Realigned.
Whatever you want to do. Of course, I noted down a lot of questions to both Hans and Birgitte, but I think that I will open up the floor instead and involve all of you sitting here and having joined us today before I do anything else. So please, we'll open up the floor for questions. It could be to one of the to one of the speakers or to everyone a general question, comment, and keep it fairly brief. But please, if you have some comments yourself, we're very happy to engage. Yeah, the floor is open basically, and we'll have someone walking around with a microphone. Yes. So, Peter on the last row. I think we'll just take yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. And for those who don't know who I am, I'm Peter Colling, and I'm head of mission of UCAP Sahel Mali. So I'm in the source of things, and one of those that haven't been chased. To go back to your interventions, and I can perhaps briefly come back to that. Just to have a couple of, I think, mine is more comments rather than questions. I think first of all, thank you very much. I think it was really good to have this very broad kind of take, and particularly also I think it's good to go back in a bit in time, as Birgitte said as well. This goes back many years, or at least now over a decade. Like Birgitte, I was also in the region, and that's where I met Signe the first time in Niger and DIFA and all that stuff when we could do that. But I think it is very important to keep the historic perspective, and particularly this differentiated approach also to the analysis of the three central Sahelian states. And I think one thing, just a little comment on your analysis, which I found really good, but I also think you kind of have a breaking point because your analysis needs to be, I wouldn't say updated, but things are moving very fast. So I think your analysis is good to where we have arrived, but I think what is important is now to look more forward. And that's just a comment from my side. And I think that there needs to be a more comprehensive analysis. I speak very often with the think tanks also in Dakar, being ISS, International Crisis Group, and so on, and they are acutely aware of that as well. And then I think just to say also that entry points. I also want to just stress the point. You didn't mention EUTM Mali, but EUTM Mali is also a good example of a mission that didn't fail, even though some say that it failed, but didn't fail. Basically, the political will for the mission to, let's say, be operational failed. So it's not a question of whether it actually failed itself. So the political guidance and the political decision-making in the EU and member states failed the mission. The Malians very much demanded support, and we couldn't deliver. So basically, that's why the mission closed. And I think if you look at the departure of the mission, which just happened a couple of weeks ago, it was a very serene departure. The general was given the Chevalier de l'Ordre National by the head of the armed forces. And that was a big recognition of what EUTM had done for the last 10 years. So I think that has to be taken into account and not underestimated, because it shows that there are still entry points if we can deliver. And then I also just, because I could talk for a long time, but I think it's really important to be very clear on our sides what are our strategic interests, and stop being reactive but being proactive. We continue to be very, very reactive in everything that happens. And it's like we're watching this movie that goes by, and we just keep reacting, but we're not being proactive, we're not being clear about what is our strategic interest, and how do we then engage. And yes, we have a military regime, but this is the fact. The political reality is that those who are the political actors is the military, whether we like it or not. So the question is here, how do we then deal with this? How do we then become proactive? How do we make proper strategic interest, not just from European side, but also together with our American allies, to enter into this so-called competing minefield that we're sitting. I'll stop here, but I could probably understand talk for a long time. Thank you.
If I may, so what should be the strategic interests? Just a quick follow-up question.
Well, I mean, there are many, and I think, first of all, our strategic interest is that we, both from an economic point of view, of course, have a vast interest in that region. We have also, don't forget, huge diasporas sitting around European countries. And also we have, I think, a security strategic interest as well, clearly. And that we have to be aware of and then engage with that. And just to make a little advertising for the mission I'm in, that we, of course, work in civil crisis management. Climate change, huge. Disaster risk reduction, yes, it's perhaps a broad area, But we have an area, Sahel is extremely fragile right now. And to go back to what Birgitte was saying, don't forget the 46 million, the 20%, but that's rising by the day, who are in dire need of a economic support. Russia's not going to come with that. China's not going to come with that. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
I have noted down quite a few questions.
Hi, thanks. I'm Niklas Størup Agerup from Oxfam Denmark, Senior Humanitarian Advisor. I used to be Oxfam International's Regional Humanitarian Coordinator based in the Sahel. I have a question for the research colleagues from DIIS and one for Birgitte. So I would like to hear your sort of crystal ball gazing on if we consider sort of the security actors and the military actors from Europe and in particular France that have been kicked out of the Central Sahel countries. I guess some of us would see that in sort of a scapegoat fashion as well. So what would you see as the next potential scapegoats from the current military authorities? And then for Birgitte, I think civil society actors in the Central Sahel, as well as NGOs and international NGOs, we feel like we are under sort of a double pressure in some sense. One pressure, very intense, comes from the authorities in the countries. And the other pressure comes from the fact that there's donor disengagement from the region. We, of course, I guess there are other colleagues from humanitarian development organizations. We think it's important to stay behind and leave no one behind. You've just come out of the senior officials meeting earlier this week, and you alluded a little bit to the importance of staying behind as well. Can you be more concrete? What will Denmark do to stay put, and I guess to support the humanitarian actors such as us? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'll start and then Andrew will elaborate. I'll just take the point of departure in this, or maybe interrogate this question of talking about scapegoats, because I think, at least mostly from Mali, to understand the depth of the contestation is that there's been for years like a very widening gap between the classe politique and what you say, la population de la base. So there's definitely this crisis of political authority and political legitimacy, which not only derives from the ballot, which many Western people think that it does. There are different sources of political legitimacy, and definitely being military position is also viewed in many places as part of political legitimacy. So I think some of that contestation is very much about the ruling elites and the way that they have allowed through extroversion, at least these are the narratives that people will say, that external friends and Paris and all that for years has engaged in who's at the party and allowed this to happen in a sense. So it's both the political class, but of course then their alliances. So I would not say that it's just a scapegoating. Of course these narratives then accelerate, but there is a very, very deep mistrust also with particular friends. And I know Andrew will speak much more about that.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts about this. I don't know how much time we have for all of it. I will say, maybe to step back a bit, that there's absolutely an aspect of scapegoating, and there's an aspect of a kind of self-serving narrative on the part of these regimes to justify their existence, to justify taking power, to justify staying in power, and then to justify the choices that they make, especially in terms of partnerships. That doesn't mean that there's also not some truth to the way that people perceive this. That doesn't mean that all of the accusations against France about digging up gold in the desert and transporting it back, things like that, that doesn't mean that they're true, but it does mean that people think that they are true, and that people often have a reason for this. These rumors aren't just disinformation. They don't come from nowhere, right? Even the things that are invented. The idea doesn't come from nowhere. And this is where I think we, the collective we, Europe, the United States often don't pay enough attention to the actual roots of those narratives. And so we think that countering disinformation means putting other information out there, but not actually addressing the basis for this thinking, and not recognizing even the basis for it. I mean, we can go back to, for instance, Emmanuel Macron's speech in Ouagadougou, where he said, I'm from the generation that doesn't know colonialism. Okay, sure, but that doesn't mean that the memory of colonialism is still there. It doesn't mean that people aren't still impacted by this. And so there's also a desire to just pretend like all of that's the past. It doesn't matter, right? And that's not, I think, how we should approach this. And then I think also there's an aspect of this, particularly when talking about France, that is very reflective of how France handled its engagement, particularly its military engagements in Mali and also in Niger, right? This thing that a couple of us were talking about this morning. But if we compare, say, France to Russia, and this is no way whatsoever to justify how Russia handles its security interventions, which has been devastating for civilian populations. But France, when France would do joint operations, generally speaking, it was France leading operations with Malian troops alongside, with Nigerian troops alongside. When now the former Wagner group goes into the field in Mali, for instance, they're conducting joint operations, genuinely joint operations, devastating, destructive, awful joint operations, but they're conducting joint operations, and they're doing operations that are designated for them by the Malian government, right? So this is where these accusations, even if the scapegoating that you talk about, even if, yes, it is scapegoating, it also reflects reality. If we want to understand why these governments have turned toward new security partners, that aspect is a very important one. The push for sovereignty, the push to actually be able to determine their own operations in their own country. Again, that doesn't make it right, that doesn't make it good, but we do have to understand where these narratives are coming from and what they reflect, not just about these ruling juntas specifically, but what they reflect about how ordinary Sahelians often see external interventions in the region and the way they've seen these external interventions sometimes for decades. If we go back to the history of development assistance and in Mali, the Château de la Sécheresse, like these chateaux built by money stolen from aid because of the drought. So we have to have a much longer perspective, and we have to be willing to be reflective and brutally honest with ourselves and with each other about the history of our own involvement. And that doesn't mean that we should pull away, not at all, but it does mean that we have to be much more honest and much more careful and listen much more when people tell us what they think.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah. And maybe if I should just add one, because many of the issues sometimes is also how these mandates are put together. The EU could not be executive mission. When Christina and I was there, they were, training people on wooden sticks, and of course that's a difficult priority that is discussed somewhere else than on the ground. Like MINUSMA couldn't deliver logistics of food supplies to their contingent in Chad and spent 80% of their resources on self-protection for a long time. But the thing is just the community, and then you're like, but in the UN you want to add gender, you want to, Marie Loy always spoke about these Christmas tree mandates, because you keep adding things that is a political priority for us somewhere else, where people are still stuck in the sand somewhere in the desert. And the thing is, people don't on the ground distinguish between the EU, the MINUSMA, the French who's there. They just see these foreign troops and they don't see their security enhancing. And I just think that's a very important perspective and something we need to debate. Yeah.
Birgitte, do you want to come in on?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Niklas. And I was privileged. I just met your Africa director. She was here from Oxfam IBIS. First of all, I and we who work on humanitarian issues, we have the deepest respect for those who are really in the front line, because we have to pay tribute. I've myself lived in difficult circumstances, and that takes. So I think it's really important to pay a lot of tribute to that. You asked me what Denmark, and I was just digging out the figures so I could also be a bit precise. Last year in 2023 for the Sahel, Denmark contributed with around 32 million euro in humanitarian assistance, and it's the plans to stay engaged also in 2024. And that will be with UN organizations and with our strategic partners like Oxfam IBIS. We know you are working there too. And you know also the way we work is really like the senior official meeting this week. Of course, we talk about obligations to protect humanitarian workers, also with the host countries. So that's quite important, humanitarian international law and so on. So it's not easy, because when you're in these situations, you are under a lot of pressure. One of our major points also this week was to support the UN presence, which is also quite difficult, because they are actually a main player in that area. Yeah, should be.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have two on my list that like to. Yeah, here we go. So.
Thank you. My name is Oscar Rothstein. I'm a journalist covering African affairs, mostly with the Danish investigative media Danwatch. I'd like to hear the panel's take on the risk facing coastal West Africa. In other words, what is the risk of some of these political and security insecurities we see in, or instabilities we see in central Sahel, to propagate to coastal West Africa? I guess we see some worrying tendencies in countries like northern Ghana, northern Benin, northern Ivory Coast to some extent. So coastal West Africa, what is the risk?
Do you want to take one more question, or just respond to that?
Yeah, maybe we should. Then, was there another question? Yeah, you're still, yeah.
Yes, hello, I'm Helle Samuelsen from Department of Anthropology, University of Copenhagen, and I've been doing research with scholars in Burkina Faso for many years. I just wanted to hear from you whether you have any insights into how these military regimes in Central Sahel is collaborating or making alliances or actually fighting the jihadist groups, or what do you know? There are so many rumors around, so I'm just interested in hearing if you have any knowledge about relationships.
Thank you so much. Who want to start? Andrew, on that last question.
Well, I can also take the coastal
Right.
question.
Perfect.
I can start there if that's.
I can do it very brief. I think, the coastal state, the prospect of these things spreading, I think that's a huge fear in these states, and I don't think that you're gonna get. And I guess that's also this thing about the strategic impatience and being engaged in the Sahel is also very much about everybody knows that these things starts there. But they don't end there. So if you can't contain them and having succeeded in containing them in the Sahelian countries, then they're gonna I think many of these actors, their aspirations doesn't stop at the border of the Sahel regions. And that also brings to your question. I think that if there's one thing that the military regime has picked up is actually the necessary and the necessity of doing cross-border collaboration also on security issues. So I think that's actually what's also, because I think many people have been looking at so how much is there, one thing is all this speak, but how much is actually going to implement into particular steps. And I think particularly that the cross-border security collaboration is one of the real actual steps that they are definitely doing at the moment. I mean, this is what France wanted with the G5 Sahel for many years. The Liptako-Goma has always been a priority, so I don't think there's anything odd in that, actually. I think it's necessary.
Yeah, I mean, there's a quite significant effort underway to fight militant groups directly. There's an irony also in that, which is that for many years, looking at the United States, looking at how Europe do counterterrorism operations, counterterrorism cooperation, there's been a tendency to move away from very security-focused language and say, well, we do whole-of-government approaches, we do development, we do governance-focused programming. And with these juntas, actually, the language is very much on hard counterterrorism operation, hard security operations. And that's been very much the priority. And it's resulted in a number of offensives against militant groups, but also against rebel groups, also against civilians. And so also a much wider, say, aperture availability for attacking civilian populations that are either just in the way or are seen as being aligned in some way with jihadist groups. This also means that a number of communities in Mali especially, but also in Burkina Faso, that have essentially been forced to sign peace accords with jihadist groups have been directly targeted and have been punished quite severely by the government, by auxiliary forces, whether mercenaries or militias, for having signed these agreements. And so there's also this very complicated and very dangerous game of local peacemaking in the region, where communities have had to fend for themselves for so long and are then punished for having done so. So that's part of why we've seen this really massive spike in civilian casualties, not just from militant groups, but also from government responses. And then to the question about coastal West Africa, it's a significant threat. So there's an established presence of JNIM, the Al-Qaeda-aligned Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims, in Benin. They have a persistent presence in parts of northern Togo. They are active in Ghana, even if they're not conducting operations, and it's kind of a question of time at this point until that happens, I think. And also in Cote d'Ivoire has done a somewhat better job of managing some of these issues, but they're still very present. I mean, if you look at militant activity, both in terms of attacks and just where they're being reported, there's a quite significant presence going further south into Mali toward the border with Cote d'Ivoire, obviously on the Cote d'Ivoire-Burkina Faso border, even moving toward Guinea. There are really persistent reports about all of this. And part of that is because there's an expansion strategy that exists for JNIM that is centrally dictated. And part of it is because the very flexible approach that the group takes, particularly toward governance and toward recruitment, means that as they move into new communities and as they look for opportunities to recruit, oftentimes it is the communities themselves or the people who come from those communities who will then insist that JNIM conduct attacks in those areas, particularly on border forces, on customs officers, things like that. But that's how it started in many places. And so there's a bit of a push-pull factor to recruitment and attacks that also privileges that kind of continued expansion. And so there are certain limits in the coastal states to how far they can really expand. But at the same time, these are very flexible groups, and it's a group that moved from being a kind of classic terrorist group to much more of an insurgent organization. Mm. And one of the persistent risks, I think, in the coastal states is that as they start to reach a limit for how far they can effectively govern and occupy territory, that in some areas there might be a return to a kind of what could be called a more classic terrorist posture of particularly conducting attacks in cities of the kind that we really haven't seen in several years in the region. But that's an intentional decision to move away from those kinds of attacks. And we could see that again in a way that could wreak, I think, pretty significant havoc in the coastal countries. And so there are enough, not to be so doom and gloom about security issues, but I think that's a very real possibility.
Thank you, Andrew. Anyone else?
Well, we had Professor Kwesi here for a few months, from Professor Kwesi Anin from the Kofi Annan Peace Center in Ghana. And he was very clear that he didn't feel that the jihadists will come to Ghana. He was very, very, he disagreed with you. I don't know how he can be so confident about this. Like you, I'm not sure Ghana is insulated against that kind of activity. But one thing I would note is that it's interesting, or maybe interesting is not the right word, but concerning maybe that you have the central Sahelian countries with Russian security backing, and then you have a completely different, coastal state set up with the US and European backing. So you actually have a kind of division here that probably is not conducive of security cooperation going forward. and that could possibly be used by actors that are that want to hurt these countries. So I'm not saying this will be like a new Iron Curtain in West Africa, but certainly we're seeing a division here that will have some impact on the situation in West Africa.
Thank you so much, Hans. Okay, so we have 4 minutes left.
I can be very, very quick. Yes, there is also in the coastal countries there is who was it? It was
Oscar.
you, Oscar, who asked me. That's for sure. Also, when you talk to their leaders, they are reaching out. That's why I talked about the role of the regional organizations. We should also talk about the Lake Chad region here. I think we'll see Senegal stepping up with a new leader. He's quite popular in the region, which could be building bridges into the central Sahel, I think. And Mauritania will also have an important role. And then you have Côte d'Ivoire, you have Ghana, you've got other actors, and I think they're feeling the threat. I think it has been answered about how the fighting of the terrorist groups do that. You were asking, Helle, but that's a complicated one. But I think that's where I will stop there. The EU has worked for a long time on integrated approaches, and of course what has been more visible has been very much the security leg of that integrated approach. But it has if you look at, I mean, it's we are in the billions of euro that have been invested in roads and infrastructure, hospitals, health, teaching, and all that.
Thank you so much, Birgitte, and thank you so much to each of one of you. Just a sort of very, very quick question, because in 2 minutes we'll go out and have a nice reception. So sort of some brief closing remarks, very brief from those of you who want to add just one last thing. Sort of what would be, now we heard from Peter Kolding that we need to update our analysis. We need to update the way that we understand these things. Sort of what would be the one thing that you take away from today's discussion when we have to move forward? If you don't mind, I would like each of you to just say something really briefly on that.
Okay, I think what is very important that perhaps the EU and member states learn from this is that this narrative about our security is their security was not a very selling point. And if you are hungry and you are offered a menu, you're going to take the course that serves your appetite. So I think we talked a lot about Russia and China today. Obviously, these are not the only external actors that wants to come in and have influence in the region. And I think Sahelian actors has always been very good at negotiating these different parts of partnerships. And this notion of partnerships, I know our Prime Minister is talking about equal partnerships. I think take it in and also. Despite the fact that we may not like what is being heard, but I think we need to listen to what goes on in the world. It's very difficult to be a dinosaur if a meteor is hitting the ground. So I guess that will be my main takeaway.
On that note, Birgitte?
Well, I'm happy then to... Well, I think my takeaway today is really... I thought it was very inspiring listening to all your inputs on the role of the digital narratives that are running, and I think there's something we simply need to engage in while still understanding. It sounds too simple, but we just have to be reminded of the big differences between the various groups in that region. But we do have a lot in common, and we have to build on that, and we have to have more dialogue. To quote the Central Sahel ambassadors I met the other day, we need more dialogue, and that's the way forward.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Andrew?
Context is essential in every way possible, historical and also present context, and also taking from Hans's presentation and from Signe's presentation, the importance of remembering how active, how things are moving all over through so many different parts of politics, security issues, but also society in the Sahel, and the need for us to be aware of that, and also to not rely on kind of the same interlocutors that people have had for so long, to really make sure that we are always looking at who we're talking to, what sources we're listening to, and trying to keep that broad and varied, and making sure that we're getting as full a picture as we possibly can, and that we also stay humble in our own thinking and our own analysis about what's going on, and really listen to people when they talk to us.
Thank you, Andrew. Hans.
Yeah, on the migration question, I'm going back to Agadez in August to see what's happening. But the news is that the caravans are leaving again across the desert into Libya, and even with military escorts. So obviously stuff is happening, and my Ghanaian contacts are saying that the Ghanaian connection men, the pushers, so-called pushers, not pushers of drugs, but pushers of people, are back on the bus stations in Niger. So I would expect to see this reflected, at least in the composition of people we're seeing on the Mediterranean within the next 6 months. But how big that situation will be, and whether it will be a result of a hidden Russian hand behind everything, I hesitate to say that. It's probably more a result of people not having any options, or being, disappointed with the promise of development, combined with the Haftar family and the Haftar alliances, the militias, and their profit seeking. So something is happening here that will be interesting to look at in the near future. And at the moment, it's an agenda, a dossier that's outside the realm of influence for the EU. So that will be something to keep an eye on going forward.
Thank you so much, Hans, and thank you all of you for these last comments. I don't know, I think I sensed a little bit of hope, perhaps not in
not
Hans's
really.
take.
No.
It's good for the connection.
And thank you indeed for a very interesting discussion and an interesting couple of hours. Also, thanks to all of you for coming. Now we have a little reception outside. Please stay along if you have the time, and otherwise, see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine.